Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Jackie Feldman. I'm an anthropologist from Gurion University, and I'll be chairing this session, which is on the topic of cohesiveness. And we have here a shift from social psychology, sociology, to speakers whose disciplines are anthropology, span anthropology and historic and religious studies. The first paper is the paper of Adoram Schneidleder, who finished just recently his doctorate in social anthropology at École des Études Sciences Sociales in Paris, on the incomplete return of Ikrit and Biram between Israel and Palestine, the internally displaced of 1948 and the alternative Christian spaces of Galilee. Unfortunately, as I will read to you, Adoram could not make it to read his paper, but at my request at 7 o'clock in the morning, I received a very elegant paper here, and I'll introduce briefly with Adoram's introduction. And then our second talk will be, I'll introduce him separately, Dr. Yuri Stoyanov afterwards. Do we have a Skype link later? Maybe.
Skype is not good enough.
Good enough, okay.
I'm trying to get him on so at least he can hear us.
Okay.
And
So we'll have the paper, and maybe he'll be able to respond questions by Skype. I'm reading for Adoram Schneidleder's paper. It is with regret that I am unable to participate in this conference. I would like to thank the organizers, Meirav, Salim, and Gabi, as well as Rawan, and to apologize to all for my sudden inability to come. I would also like to thank Jackie for reading this paper, if that is what he is doing right now, which indeed I am. Due to my operation last Tuesday, this paper is not as polished as I would have liked it to be. From the beginning, I had always intended it as an invitation for discussion and to strengthen the paper as a result of discussion with all of you, so I regret all the more not being present in order to participate. And by afterward, I also regret that Adoram couldn't be here to impress you with the incredible wealth of the ethnographic detail, rare ethnographic detail that he's able to bring on Ikrit and Biram, in order to show that really anthropology is in the details, and how the view of two very similar, so to speak, communities from the periphery, small communities, can have very wide and important theoretical and social implications for understanding the greater picture. With that said, the paper just a minute. The paper is called Structural Variance in Political Strategies and Identity Between Greek Catholics and Maronites in Israel, the example of Iqrith and Biram. Arab Christians, European intervention, and political identity. Scientific research concerned with Arab Christians of the Middle East has repeatedly pointed out the determining role played by European intervention in the structuring of contemporary communitarian dynamics and strategics of political identity. European intervention increased during the Counter-Reformation, following the creation of the Congregation de Propaganda Fide in 1622, and most significantly, following the Ottoman reconquest of the Syrian provinces in 1840, when Christian Arabs became privileged mediums for the expansion of European interests throughout the empire and for inter-European rivalries. This intervention contributed to distinguish and communitarize Arab Christians of the Middle East, notably by enhancing a socioeconomic divergence from the Muslim majority and by offering foreign alternative sources of power, and by producing the cognitive categories of perceived cultural proximity to the West. The privileged relationship between Christian Arabs and the imagined West may constitute one of the major components of Christian Arab political identity over the last 100 years. A few authors concerned with Christian Arab identity have suggested a tension between two opposing orientations which reflect the role of perceived proximity to the imagined West. Sabra, opposes what he calls an Arab Christian orientation to an Eastern Christian one. The first is characterized by a distancing from the West, a downplaying of the Muslim-Christian confessional divide, and an expressed identification with Arab and even Islamic culture. Conversely, the Eastern Christian orientation accentuates the Muslim-Christian dividing line and rejects identification with Islamic and even Arab culture in an attempt to draw closer to an imagined West. For Sabra, the Arab Christian, quote, seeks, quote, to avoid estrangement from Muslims at all costs, while the Eastern Christian strives, quote, to save Middle Eastern Christianity at all costs, end quote. In Amalia Sa'ar's study of Christians in Haifa, Sabra's Arab Christian orientation corresponds to her, quote, Palestinian national identity, while the Eastern Christian orientation corresponds to Sa'ar's, quote, socially reproductive orientation. More recently, Lauren Leibarger's study of Christian Arabs of the West Bank, particularly in Jenin, Nablus, suggests three main political projections. Traditional secular nationalism, one. Second, religio-communal revitalization similar to the Islamic one. And third, apolitical piety resulting in an otherworldly flight from the world. In this paper, I will use Sabra's simplified model as a template to explore a structural variant between Greek Catholic strategies of political identity and Maronite ones in Israel. I will do so through the comparison of two communities of internally displaced persons from 1948 in Israel, Iqrith and Biram. Although the two communities have mostly been closely associated in the mind of the press and in scholarly research, important differences exist, notably in the nature of their political strategies and expressions of identity. While the community of Bir'em is politically polarized around the two poles suggested by Sabra's model in an articulate and militant way, in Ikrit, both poles are represented by individuals of the community, but without political polarization or radicalization. While a few factors can be suggested in order to explain this, my hypothesis is that a structural variation results foremost from the two communities' respective belonging to two different denominations, the Maronite and the Greek Catholic. The paper will provide a description of political expressions and organizations within the two communities before providing an example of variations in their concrete application. I will conclude with an argumentation attributing these variants to the different confessional belongings. Ikrit and Biram, displacement and internal political organization. In November 1948, the two communities of the villages of Iqrith and Bir'em along the border with Lebanon were evacuated by the Israeli army. In this manner, they became part of the internally displaced Palestinians of 1948, who, according to estimates, represent between 20 and 25% of Palestinians who have become citizens of Israel in the wake of the 1948 war. While many of the internally displaced abandoned hope of returning to their abandoned villages, or at least abandoned political activism to attain this objective after the 1950s, the communities of Iqrith and Bir'em continued to struggle and maintain hope in a way that has distinguished them from the other internally displaced persons. But if Iqrith and Bir'em constitute an exceptional case, my PhD dissertation argues that this exception is not the result of objective historical circumstances such as their victory in a 1951 Israeli Supreme Court decision, but foremost as a result of the Christian-Arab habitus which distinguishes their political horizon from that of most other Palestinian displaced persons who, apart from a few exceptions, are Muslim. Over the last 60 years, the struggle and perspective of return has played a key role in the continued revival of both communities' existence as coherent social units. In the hands of the first generation after displacement, the struggle for return adopted a political strategy which in part complied with established Israeli structures of control, avoided association with political forces expressing communal Arab rights such as the Communist Party, and focused on Israeli public opinion, the decision of the Supreme Court, and at times church leaders such as the Greek Catholic Archbishop of Galilee, Yosef Raya. The political strategy adopted always insisted on the communities being, quote, law-abiding Israeli citizens, end quote. This approach, dominant in both communities, can be compared to Sabra's model of the Eastern Christian orientation, or Sa'ar's socially reproductive orientation, in that it downplays collective Arab political identification, makes use of communitarian tools of power, like church institutions, and turns towards a Western alternative to the Arab Muslim majority. In this case, it turns to the benevolence of the perceived holders of political power, the mainstream Israeli Jewish public, which in the case of polarized conceptual groups in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, opposes an Israeli West against a Palestinian East. As of the mid-1980s, within both communities, tensions around the strategies adopted in the struggle for return became expressed in terms of internal organization. This tension coincided with the coming of age of the second generation of Birmaniyun and Iqrithawiyun, both born as Israeli citizens, some members of which wished to abandon the docile political path adopted till then and which had borne little fruit. In 1987, the Birmaniyun decided to create an elective committee in order to represent their community and lead the struggle for return. Introducing a democratic elective process, this was a radical break from the previous committees organized on the basis of representatives of the extended families. In the summer of the same year, a group of young members of the third generation, eager to break with the political path of the previous generation, organized the first summer camp on the ruins of the village. Calling themselves Al-Auda, the Return, this movement evolved over the years to a much higher level of political articulation and a much more radical break from the strategies adopted by the community of Biram during the first decades. The most significant tendency was an increased and militant identification with Palestinian nationalism and political activism. Over the last 9 years, this political activism expressed itself in various ways. For example, the summer camp, which is Al-Auda's main activity, became the occasion for inviting political guests and experimenting in bringing together children from Palestinian refugee camps in the West Bank with children of internally displaced persons in Israel. Al-Auda's militant Palestinian identification and its categorical refusal of preceding strategies adopted by the community of Bir'em places its approach as a very articulate expression of Sabra's Arab Christian orientation or Leibarger's secular nationalism orientation. Within the same community of Bir'em, a radically opposing political expression has taken shape in the last 10 years. In the mid-2000s, the Maronite priest of Jish, the village to which the people of Bir'em were displaced in 1948, and which still holds 1/3 of the community's population, introduced Aramaic language lessons as a free activity promoted by the church. This initiative catered to the sensitivities of some members of the community of Bir'em, who in turn took this activity upon themselves and today are at the origin of a newly expressed political force within the community. The leaders of this group have managed, first of all, to obtain the official approval of Aramaic language courses in the elementary public school of Jish. Finally, their biggest victory dates to last summer when Aramaic was officially recognized as a new category of nationality for Israeli citizenship alongside Jewish, Arab, Druze, and Circassian. The underpinning language behind the Aramaic revival movement is a militant dissociation from any form of Palestinian nationalism or Arab collective belonging argued on the basis of ethnic affiliation. The arguments deployed are resonant with ones advanced by Copts in Egypt and Maronites in Lebanon at various times over the last century. In this specific case, the Aramaic movement in Jish resorts to an arsenal of previous Lebanese Maronite nationalist theory on top of a nearly 100-year-old history of Maronite Zionist collaboration in a political strategy which caters to the Israeli control system's creation of what Hillel Cohen called good Arabs. Diametrically opposed to Al-Auda, the Aramaic revival is a perfect illustration of Sabra's Oriental Christian orientation. In the year 2010, elections were held for a new committee in Bir'em. The members of Al-Auda and those of the Aramaic revival constituted opposite extremes of the internal political landscape, and the campaign created an increasing tension with a polarizing and dividing effect on the community. Out of 11 seats, each group won 3. The summer of the same year saw for the first time a huge brawl develop on the site of the destroyed village as a result of the internal political tension. Now turn to Iqrith and the political middle ground. Within the community of Ikrit, political organization and its expressions are quite different. No such polarization exists, and no internal political party articulating a strategy with a clear political allegiance is on the map. Within the community, there have always been individuals who clearly expressed or applied approaches conforming with either Sabra's Oriental Christian orientation or his Arab Christian orientation. One outspoken member with an approach close to the Arab Christian orientation, for example, is the poet Unisbet, but no organized political party ever emerged applying one of these approaches in such a clear and radical way as do both Al-Auda and the Aramaic movement in Biram. In the middle of the 1980s, like in Bir'em, tension arose opposing members of the younger second generation to those of the first generation, who were largely in charge of the representative committee that was established on a family base, not as an elective one. But not only was the younger generation unable to change the internal political organization, unlike in Bir'em, but they were also unsuccessful in upsetting the strategy applied over the last few decades. In the late 1990s, this frustration led to the creation of 2 rival associations who functioned at the same time as the representative committee. Neither ever came to express a political will like their Birmani counterparts. Finally, it was only in 2008 that the third generation was able to inaugurate an elective process and establish a new committee with new faces. While this was a pleasant development, the political strategies deployed in the quest for return did not change radically from those used in the past. Mostly, the election did not give way to the articulation of parties presenting programs of distinct political coloring. Within the community of Ikrit, nothing similar to Al-Auda or the Aramaic movement exists. While opinions or dispositions resonant with either of the two movements can be found among individuals in Iqrith, such politically articulate politically articulate parties are missing. Nothing would be more wrong, however, than to conclude that the Ikritawiyun have preferred a path of political apathy. The political actions of the elective committee steer a thoughtful course between the two poles without ever coming close to the extremes. The committee can engage in soliciting the Vatican for support in their struggle on the one hand, while at the same time not hesitate to place Ikrit on the politically symbolic map of Palestine through collaboration with Zochrot on the other. The limit that has not yet been crossed is that of collaboration with the organization representing all of the internally displaced persons in Israel, which would place a symbolic end to Ikrit's discourse and strategy of exceptionality. While the committee applies its calculated political strategies, youth in Ikrit apply another and have been occupying their village site since 2012. Their actions are strengthened by a conviction in the justice of their cause, a conviction of their Palestinian national belonging, and by their active participation in the cultural movement characteristic of what Dani Rabinovich and Khawla Abu Bakr have called the Stand Tall generation. An illustration of these differences between Ikrit and Bir'em is to be found in the community's relations with Zochrot and Adrid, the Association for Defense of Rights of the Internally Displaced. Created in the Oslo years and as a reaction to the exclusion of the displaced persons from the negotiation table, Adrid has always looked towards Iqrith and Bir'em as an example and role model, and has always hoped that the two village communities would officially join the ranks of the many other village communities in the association. Since its creation, however, the committees of both Ikrit and Bir'em have always refused an official collaboration. For example, return marches organized by Adrid have never been permitted on either the site of Ikrit or Bir'em. Such a political orientation would be too strong a break with both communities' preceding strategy and discourse of exceptionality. While many members of Ikrit would like an open collaboration with Adrid, no organized political voice can be heard in this direction. In Bir'em, on the other hand, Al-Awda's agency includes an overt desire of affiliation with Adrid, and their activities often involve members of Adrid. While the goal of Zochrot is, quote, to say the Nakba in Hebrew, end quote, in other words, to make the Palestinian tragedy and narrative known and available to a Jewish-Israeli public, its activities also contribute to the fleshing out of an alternative Palestinian geography of lieu de mémoire within Israel. Although the intended public is the Jewish-Israeli one, the Palestinian citizens of Israel are also consumers of the political geography Zochrot contributes to establish. When Zochrot approached Bir'em and Ikrit in the year 2010 in order to organize activities on the two village sites and publish a book on each, the varied results illustrate the points made above. In Ikrit, Zochrot was able to work closely and efficiently with the representative committee. Indeed, this project had nothing to scare the committee with, and on the contrary, Zochrot's action was right in line with their hearts and their political strategy. In Bir'em, on the other hand, the representative committee did not participate in the project, and all collaboration was done strictly between Zochrot and members of Al-Awda. As a result, for example, a link to Zochrot's activity can be found on Ikrit's webpage, but not on Bir'em's. Conclusion. The Maronite narrative of otherness and the more radical polarization of Bir'em. What we have been considering in this paper are two village communities who suffered nearly the same fate and whose struggle for return after displacement in 1948 underwent many of the same structural evolutions. However, the political expressions in both communities, although they draw on the same opposing tendencies described by Sabra as characteristic of Christian Arabs in the Middle East, obey a different organizational scheme. Simply put, the community of Bir'em is polarized in a much more extreme way, each of the two opposite poles described by Sabra becoming expressed by a clear, dynamic, and militant internal political organization. In Iqrith, neither pole is expressed in such a way. Although I have not had time here to present their argumentation, I'll briefly evoke the conclusions I came through in my PhD regarding this question. Three elements offer explanation. First, the different levels of social cohesiveness in each of the respective communities in the pre-1948 period and over the 20 years following their displacement in 1948. Ikrit's social cohesiveness appears to have been much more deeply perturbed by the events of 1936 and of 1948 than in Bir'em. Second, the successful reterritorialization of the home community of Bir'em in the host village of Jish, as opposed to the unsuccessful reterritorialization of the home community of Iqrith in the host village of Rami. These two elements contribute to the structure of the community's political vitality and life today. However, more than either of these two arguments, the reason behind the more extreme political polarization in Bir'em appears to stem from the community's Maronite belonging as opposed to Iqrit's Greek Catholic belonging. Sabra's Oriental Christian orientation is most virulently expressed where Christian communities have the opportunity of going as far as to claim their disassociation from the Arab world on ethnic terms. Maronite communities of Lebanon and the Maronite minority of Galilee who descend from them have a strong tradition, more than 100 years old, of intellectual efforts and literature expressing their conceptual separation from the Arab other. Such a heritage is lacking among the Greek Catholic. Within the specific community of Bir'em, Lebanese origins and Maronite particularity were cultivated social distinctive traits before 1948, as they continued to be during the decades following displacement and the creation of the State of Israel. This undercurrent guided much of the community's political action during the 1950s through today, and is still echoed by the mainstream dominant in the current committee. When Palestinian nationalism gained ground among Palestinians in Israel during the 1980s, a new current developed in Biram. Reflecting general tendencies throughout the Galilee, this movement also had internal motives which are not entirely alien to specific issues of land ownership within the community. Al-Awda became very active, while the running committee had been unable to achieve anything concrete in decades. As reaction to Al-Awda developed, however, among certain Bir it turned to radical forms of Maronite nationalism and Aramaic identity. During the last 10 years, both extremes nourished each other, causing each to articulate even clearer ways their political strategies, which also use the languages of national and ethnic identity. Among the Greek Catholics of Ikrit, on the other hand, a Maronite narrative of ethnic differentiation from the Arab world is not part of the common heritage. Affiliation to the Arab world in ethnic terms is never a question. The only options are those of political strategies. In this field, everyone has his or her own opinion, or maybe even several opinions. Political action becomes a judicious and pragmatic navigation between the extreme poles defined by Sabra. Defending the idea of an affiliation to the Arab world or to the Palestinian nation is not something which needs to be done, as Al-Awda must do in the midst of the community of Bir'em. In Ikrit, it is quite natural. Thank you.